Hello, welcome back to the second episode of Tales from the Gridsquare. Today we're going to pick right back up where we left off with the ghosts in the ruins of Samarra. I had participated with the invasion of Iraq back in 2003 as an Abrams crew member in the United States Army. We marched all the way north to Mosul, then turned around and headed back to Samarra where we finally set up a permanent forward operating base. Near Samarra were the incredible ancient ruins of the spiral minaret and the Golden Mosque, later destroyed by ISIS. The ruins were incredible, and even though I was never able to actually walk through there and check it out, we patrolled nearby to make sure everything was quiet. One time, filling in for a gunner's position, we were scanning the ruins at night to look for any obvious hot spots of insurgents. Some of the stones in these ruins still retained residual heat from the hot sun, so they would produce a glow on our IR sights. This only happened a few times and was reported by several tank crews, as well as our scouts with their LRS trucks. But sometimes when scanning the ruins, there were cold spots moving through the ruins and in between the burial sites at the nearby mausoleum. These would show up clear as day on our powerful main gun sights, but there were no bodies, objects, or anything like that. Incredibly cold spots moving slowly around through the ruins, moving in front and behind the stones. It was the weirdest thing. I remember seeing that on that deployment, and we never really got an answer as to what was going on. UFOs over Taji, Iraq. Tank commander on an Abrams M1A2 September MTB, and my platoon and I, 4 Abrams, were spread out about 1,000 meters along MSR Tampa to keep an eye on the convoys. It's probably around 0300 in the morning, and I have my entire crew get some sleep while I stay up monitoring the CITV. While doing a routine scan, I see a light up in the sky that's brighter than anything else that I can see that night. It pops up on the CITV, and I can see it with my own eyes. I think the tank running on battery power, so there's no noise from the turbine, and the CITV doesn't require hydraulics, so it's silent. Whatever this thing was, it made no noise. It hovered in place, probably 300 to 400 meters out, moved around a bit, then just took off super fast. I never really felt threatened by it, just super curious. This was 2006, so personal drones weren't really a thing in small Iraqi villages at the time, and the only drones we had there were incredibly loud and couldn't hover in place. I talked to my platoon about it, and no one else saw anything. I chalked it up to lack of sleep, stress, and dehydration. They could be right, but it certainly seemed real to me, whatever the hell it was. Vietnam now is the next story. So, my father was in Vietnam and saw some crazy shit. One base he was on, which he won't tell me the name of it since it's no longer there, and he doesn't want me to try to look it up and accidentally end up on a watch list, was a sweet assignment. My dad had to work in an office, fix copiers and printers and sort random nonsense paper. He said he got picked out to be sent there and that it was an easy assignment. So he's in a small base with about 100 other guys, all sorts of people, all again picked out to be stationed there. They used to come up with stories and jokes about why they were sent there, but it was cool at first. They would party and have fun. Typical old school army shenanigans. My dad worked with a crew of about 12 to 15 other guys. None of the papers made any sense. The only way they could sort them was by number at the top. Some were things like certain types of flowers. Some didn't even make sense at all, and they were like word vomit. They would get boxes and boxes of these papers to sort every day via a big truck. They didn't have a quota or really anyone telling them what to do, so they just usually worked 6 to 8 hours. They would call it quits for the night. Around 2 or so months in, they would start to experience something that became a regular phenomenon. My dad said he woke up one morning to everything in his room shaking, like he was in the middle of an earthquake. Everyone was outside looking around. My dad asked a few guys what they were looking for, and one of the guys said they saw something big fly over the base. My dad thought maybe it had been a bomber or something, so he brushed them off, and after that they had regular earthquakes to the point where they wouldn't react anymore. At night they started to see lights and colors flash outside their windows, and they would hear noises if they were outside alone night or day. A few guys got spooked and would request to be reassigned. One by one, guys who were usually chill and laid back would snap and become panicked shells of themselves. One night my dad is outside when he hears what sounds like running, like someone in full sprint but all around him, like it was everywhere he looked, but he was just missing seeing what was running. He tossed the cigarette away and started to walk off. He started to hear what sounded like a squeaking noise behind him and began to be filled with pure dread, more than he has ever felt in his life, like he knew he was about to die. He snapped out of it once he saw fire spreading and ran to grab an extinguisher, but when he came back it was daylight and people were out looking for him. He had been missing for 4 hours. 4 hours. It felt like minutes to him. Not long after, another guy went crazy and set a building on fire. Big trucks showed up and my dad and the others left that base. Well, my dad was a bit of a shithead and decided to go AWOL, which stands for absent without leave. Don't do that. With a few others to find that base. He said when he reached the area, the entire place was an overgrown field. Like nothing had ever been there before. My dad couldn't explain it. But in the following years, everyone he spoke to couldn't tell him about that base. Just my dad and a handful of others there with him. Al Anbar Burning Bush is the next story. The story you posted about Al Anbar 2018, I was there as well. Now I don't think this story qualifies as haunted, supernatural, or anything like that, but to this day I have no explanation for what I saw, and you might get a kick out of it. Now plenty of boys had ghost stories around camp that their posts were haunted. Packs of wild dogs roamed freely throughout the base. Some of these dogs were big, mean looking. Most of them were starved, but there were also ones that were well fed. The point is, there was enough reason to be on your toes walking around at night. Anyway, here's my story. I was lucky enough to pull the night shift nearly the whole deployment, and I was glad for it. The days were hotter than well, on this night, on a post that had become second home to me, I saw something. For orientation, I will say the camp had about 600 meters of open desert in front of it without obstruction. There was a road running across the frontage at nearly the 600 meter mark. Now, I stress this detail because I want you to understand that by this time of the deployment, I know every square inch of that 600 meter frontage. It's pitch black and quiet as always when suddenly I see a light. Not a vehicle light on the road, which occasionally happened. This was a low glow and much closer than the road. My initial thought is that it's a headlamp. I figured some Iraqi soldier was moving outside their post, but it was much too close. Maybe 400 or 500 meters? And there were never any Iraqis closer than the road. We had no shortage of optics. I had a TA thermal scope on hand and I looked into the desert. Not a person, but a small smoking bush. A bush was on fire. It was much clearer on thermals, but there was nobody and nothing else around. It was a small bush, like the kind you trip over running range 410. I scanned the desert for any nearby movement, but nothing. I stare into the thermals relentlessly. This is the most exciting thing to happen on the post in months. Eventually, the smoldering bush calms. Now, I am confused, but not overly excited. Suddenly, I notice a new glow, maybe 250 meters to the right of the last one, and closer. But there's no one, and nothing around it to have started it. I'm not the only one who sees it. Another guy on duty confirms what I see, although he is much less interested. This continues for the next few hours. One flame goes out, another starts in a different direction, in a different location. These are sparse desert weeds, at least 6 to 10 meters apart. The fire starts hundreds of meters apart, and there's no wind. The distance between the flames was too far and random to be natural transference. To this day, I have no idea how these fires started. Spontaneous combustion? Who knows? The next one is Through the Crow. Afghanistan 2020 at CL Dwyer. We had towers from 0-100 to 0-800. My friend and I were on Tower 2 that watched over the ECP lane, which stands for Entry Control Point Lane. Some other guys from my platoon also had similar experiences to mine. We always took turns sleeping, so he's knocked out on my Crow system. I could see a black blob on the Crow, moving along the concrete walls just floating. It only lasted a couple of seconds, but I put on my MVGs and went outside to see if anyone was on the lane coming towards the tower, and no one was there. That was the first time I had ever seen the Crow system act up like that, so I don't know if it was a malfunction or something weird. Strangely enough, my friend had a weird experience in that tower too, and a certain anonymous individual and I were sitting in the tower, and our radio started making pig noises and just freaking out. And then the Crow started changing on its own, and the screen was changing colors and going black very fast. And then the screen stayed one solid color and the gun kept charging. Weird. The next story is Guardian Angel. In 03, OAF-1, a terrible sandstorm was coming in. I had been standing guard on an OP all night, which stands for Observation Post. So I was getting some rest in one of those big tents. It was just all the OP guys in that tent, but I was the only one in that tent sleeping. Everybody else was on guard, was at the guard shack or at an OP. While I was sleeping, I was violently shaken awake by two hands on both sides of my body. A voice said to leave the tent. I opened the flap to the tent to a very windy, horrible sandstorm rolling in. Hardcore. A few seconds later, the big wooden beams that held that tent up collapsed. I would have been crushed by those beams if I hadn't been woken up. I believe it was an angel. I know there are probably some hardcore folks on here that don't believe in God, hate God, but it was real. Curious if anyone else has a similar story while on deployment. The next story is Tree People. Tree People. My husband served in Vietnam from 1970 to 1971. He and others saw what they called tree spirits in Vietnam. Tree spirits are soldiers who died fighting in Vietnam. My husband said you could see shadows that looked like soldiers with weapons. He said you could distinguish the shadows if they were Viet Cong, NVA, and even American soldiers. Perhaps guarding the area? He didn't think these spirits knew they were dead. The night sky would light up with artillery illumination rounds, and he would see them in the trees. Vietnam stories, crazy. The next story is Miles. My dad's late friend Miles used to be in recon battalion in Vietnam. He saw some messed up stuff because they were usually alone and way ahead of everyone. He told me that once in a while you'd see people at night, like silhouettes in the trees, bushes, and grass. He described a few of them as black and others as predator-like. Because they are in the thick of it, anything could mean the enemy, so they acted accordingly. But nothing would phase these things. You'd shoot, but they would just stand there and stare. Miles used to tell me that he believed the government was doing experiments out there or the land was cursed. He also believed that they were ghosts who couldn't leave the field, so they were just waiting and watching. Miles was a crazy bastard even up until his death, but when it came to Vietnam, he was dead serious, and he swore he wasn't lying. Alright, the next one is Afghan UFOs. In Afghanistan, I saw lights flying around way faster than anything humans make. My platoon had a video of it once, and I've been trying to hunt it down, but no one seems to have it anymore, which breaks my heart because it was trippy. I've been trying to hunt down that video since 2012. They were the same thing you see from F-18 videos on FLIR, but they were dancing around on the mountaintops near Kandahar looking east. Usually 2 or 3 at a time started slowly hovering on the ridgeline, crisscrossing, then speeding up and abruptly stopping, defying all physics. I remember me and a team leader just standing there while on patrol watching them. I even called it up to my company and told them. They didn't see it, I guess. We watched for a few more minutes and then it just took off straight up. Even more oddly, we just picked up and continued to walk on patrol like it never happened. Honestly, it was far off to say if it was Tic Tac shape or not, and it was nighttime through MVGs, but most likely. Saw it 2 or 3 times over 8 months in Afghanistan. Next story, Vietnam. I don't know all the terminology he used, but I will tell you the best I can. My dad was in the 101st Airborne and carried an M60, so I guess you could call him the big gun, I think. He would start by saying it was a rainy night. He said you could set the time on watch by rain on most days. Then there were times it would rain for days. Well, during one of the times when it had been raining for days, he said he had been posted on the camp's perimeter as security. There may have been some details I'm missing that military folks may understand. He said it had gotten dark and the rain was relentless. There was almost continuous lightning. He was seated behind a fallen tree with his M60 pointing into the darkness over the tree as it was perched on its tripod. After a bit of time sitting in the rain and lightning, he heard movement in front of him. Before he could notify anyone else, he said a giant gorilla rushed him. A f***ing gorilla, bro. He said he could see the lightning flashes as it came at him. He said he then opened fire on it, hitting it several times. After all the commotion was over, there was no gorilla to be found, only blood on the ground. He swore what he saw was a giant gorilla. I remember him telling me this story before I heard anything about the rock ape stories. That's crazy. You know that there's a lot of guys that got killed by tigers in Vietnam even, so a gorilla wouldn't be far off. Anyway, next story. Bari Alai. The OP was Bari Alai, notably the first time for the Taliban successfully overran a US outpost in the war. We retook it and held it with a company-sized element. We significantly improved it by airlifting, no road access, better weapons, and supplies, among other notable improvements. One night I was doing what I did best, stirring our waste with JP8 until it was burned and could be disposed of off the mountainside. Now, when I say the midnight sky was clear, it was breathtakingly clear. One by one until 3 arrived, lights, not much larger than stars, appeared in the heavens. 2 were star-like blue, but one was red. Nothing odd right away. However, they began to rapidly and independently dart, and even more eerily, stop and change direction completely. No man-made platform could move at this comet-like speed, dead stop, and ultimately change direction. It was more fascinating than eerie, but it made you feel insignificant in that midnight dark mountainous valley. Next story, something big. Guard shift, 0100. Myself and another private staring into the dark abyss of the Kunar River Valley below. The glow of MVGs reflecting on our eye, our only light. Our shack is 8 by 8 made of plywood, barely strong enough to hold the anti-mortar single sandbag layer on the roof. Metallica quietly plays on a speaker. Many sightings of large creatures had happened in the mountains, some even taller than us. Always through thermals and always far, far away and blurry. Tonight was different. Something big jumped onto the side of our guard shack and latched on with claws. It climbed up to our roof as a large cat would, right up a vertical face. There was some creaking from the added weight. It jumped down into the dark and was not seen again. Okay, that would be pretty terrifying, not gonna lie. Okay, this will be the last story for this episode. Afghanistan Skinwalker, Part 1. Okay, so it starts with my dad. He's on watch in a deserted village top facing a mountain. He and his group are situated at a wall overlooking the village. Along with this village, there is a wall. Now, this wall has doors leading into small square spaces, which were most likely homes. This wall was about roughly 30 to 40 feet, keep in mind. So my dad is mounted on this wall. Look down the alley they are situated on. He has a 50 caliber turret of some kind. I can't recall what he said, but I do know that he said it was a 50 caliber. He's also got NVGs and other night vision optics. Sorry if I don't know all the correct terms for this, but he is sitting there on that wall and he sees a man walking down the mountain about 500 meters from his group. This is unusual because it is 0300 in the morning, and there is just a man casually walking around this abandoned village at 2 or 3 in the morning. So he sees him and starts closely watching him. He says that the man sees him, looks at him, and then keeps walking. But he is walking weirdly and then gets on all fours and turns into a whole panther. He thought he was sleep deprived since they had spent all night driving to get there, but he rubbed his eyes and he's trying to wake up his buddy he called Cooter. What a nice name. As well as his first sergeant, since this was his first deployment. So he's throwing these discarded caliber rounds at his group and they aren't waking up. He just looked back through his NVG scope or something and saw this thing jump onto the wall. When it jumped on the wall, it was about 60 to 100 meters away from him. So he started yelling. His guys woke up. Then what they saw, and they were laughing at him and telling him he just saw things. But he knew what he saw and he stood by it. The next night, it's Cooter's turn and he sees the same thing, but it gets closer. So Cooter woke up my dad and said that he saw it, and he said he was freaking out and he finally knew he was serious. And that's part 1. For part 2 of the Skinwalker portion, we'll have to go into the next episode. So anyway, thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this episode or you enjoyed this video, please like, share, subscribe, send to your friends, and I appreciate you taking the time to watch. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks. We'll see you next time.